The Divide, JD Phillips. 1. From the moment Amari first made eye contact with the doe-eyed girl, he knew he was doomed. He guessed her to be around 10 years of age, 11 at most. But she was built small, and therefore struck him as even more fragile. He found her sitting alone, locked inside a barred cage no bigger than a dog kennel, surrounded by flames and corpses. It was a ghastly sight, to be sure, but he'd found it impossible not to admire the grin she gave him as he approached her cage. Between her round, dimpled cheeks, large blue-violet eyes, and wispy curls of citrus blonde hair shining against the blaze of the fire, Amari had been at once instantly charmed and enraged anyone could have been cruel enough to treat such a child so harshly. Of course, it wasn't just anyone responsible for the crime. Amari hadn't even been in Atraxia a full day before he was cursed and spit upon by a small group of angry villagers. He'd been forced to get back on board his ship and move on to the next closest port town, for fear the people might set it on fire while he was buying supplies. The greeting he'd received in the second town wasn't much kinder than the first, but at least he'd been given a moment of clarity before the stones came flying at his head. The people had called him LaSalle, Marius LaSalle, to be exact, his brother's name. Amari recognized the symbol painted on the burning carriage alongside the girl's cage instantly, knew Marius was behind it, and that meant turning tail and returning to his ship as soon as possible was the smartest thing he could possibly do. And yet how could he, when that funny sense that had served him so well after leaving his homeland behind had led him to her in the first place? He'd developed a sense, he didn't know what else to call it, for finding the right person or thing when he needed them after a near-death experience in his teens. When he'd needed someone skilled at self-defense to teach him how to fend for himself, he'd conveniently bumped into a retired guardsman named Gian, willing and able to oblige. When he'd needed a new place to call home, he'd instinctually wandered into one of the few inns in Dorthal, willing to rent long-term. When he needed coin, he'd always found odd jobs or lucky tables at the gambling resort, or, occasionally, loose coin or discarded purses holding the exact amount he needed to buy a meal. His uncanny luck had also led to the purchase of his ship, the Gracie May, not only by lining his pockets with enough coin, but also by helping him score a seat in a card game with the only man in Dorthal stupid enough to put such a prize on the line in the first place. Amari's ship-claiming win was unfortunate for the irate captain, and might have ended badly for Amari, if not for his ability to charm and disarm. One of the few things his father had taught him he was actually grateful for: the crew. The captain was not the only one who called the Gracie May home, after all, and the crew had come looking for Amari when they heard their boat had been gambled away yet again. They'd planned to beat the new owner to a pulp and steal the title back until Amari greeted them with cups of tea and explained he was in need of an experienced crew. The fact he'd unknowingly befriended the captain's first mate Castor months earlier only helped sweeten the deal. Castor vouched for Amari and recognized the many ways a home on the water would be beneficial to his cause. He talked the crew into agreeing to serve Amari, not only on board the boat, but beyond, and as such the number of people dedicated to seeing Amari's goals realized nearly doubled overnight. The downside to his ability, however, was that it wasn't always easy to spot why a particular person or thing was what he needed. He'd been drawn to all sorts of things he'd still never found a use for, and he'd been punched or threatened more times than he could count for approaching someone who misinterpreted the reason behind his sudden interest. Sometimes he later heard of an accident or unexpected swell that could have caused him or his ship harm, had he not been lying on the floor, cradling his bloodied lip at the time. At least those cases made a certain sense, confirmed that while he might never understand the way of the universe, he could at least appreciate and respect it did know what it was doing. This was not one of those times. He'd known even before he found the girl he was being drawn to her for a reason. He'd felt the similar tingle at the base of his neck, the overwhelming surge of eagerness and trepidation that told him he needed to pay attention. Then he came across the flames and carnage and felt a wave of fear mix alongside his understanding of the situation. The girl was a Den-Nai. The faint wisps of arced lines like tiny birds in flight trailing down the sides of her neck told him that much straight away. And the dead men responsible for locking her in a cage had worked for Marius, which meant he'd stepped blindly into a huge pile of shit. He'd been a teenager when he'd set eyes upon a Den-Nai in person for the first time. Like most people in Visconti at that time, his knowledge of what some described as the Blue People came from various textbooks or word of mouth. Den-Nai were born with Hesh, the Earth's own life force, in their veins, and could be easily identified by the bright blue streaks imprinted on their skin. Legends stated that they were direct descendants of the gods that lived across the Veil, and it was that connection that allowed them to take certain control over natural elements. It was easy to fear them. Anyone capable of sparking a fire simply by calling upon elements in the air was a potential threat, and that naturally made the majority eager to suppress and abuse them. Countries like Visconti and her neighbor Luxem had stripped their land bare of naturally occurring Hesh needed to power their homes and cities ages ago, and so, once it was discovered Hesh could be stripped from the blood of Den-Nai in a similar manner, they began to rely on more nefarious means of collecting this stuff. Many years and unspeakable acts later, most men and women knew enough about the Den-Nai to realize their survival was directly related to the survival of everyone and everything else. Slavery and Hesh stripping were on the decline, but fears remained as humans proved time and time again, fear could drive even the most rational man to do unspeakable things. Amari, in many ways, knew little more about the Den-Nai now than he had as a teen, but one had saved his life once, and that seemed reason enough to attempt the same now, even as the girl offered a sharp, prideful smile that told she was the one responsible for the current carnage. She had lit the fires, and somehow caused the men's weapons to explode in their hands. She had single-handedly turned the tide on her captors and dealt Marius a nasty blow and, thinking he was Marius, she wanted to give him a moment to acknowledge she was about to do the same to him. Except Amari was unarmed, aside from the ornately carved and lacquered walking staff he rarely stepped on shore without. It could be twisted and pulled apart at the center to unsheathe twin blades hidden inside a pinch, but fortunately did not contain anything even remotely explosive. He also hoped his face was not nearly sinister enough to be mistaken for his brother by someone who had actually seen Marius up close and personal, and this girl had, he sensed, been quite close to Marius indeed. Amari hadn't been in Atraxia long, but he'd already heard whispers enough to know Marius rarely left any Den-Nai behind alive or well enough to describe his features in detail. He charged through villages along with his men, raiding homes, dragging the Den-Nai out as they went along. Those who resisted were either killed instantly or neutralized, which was, as best Amari understood it, a horrible and almost always fatal form of punishment no one cared to speak about. Other Den-Nai were rounded up into cages much like the girls and carted off to slavers, newly built incinerators, or some other form of mass extermination. Only the gods knew for certain, but none, as far as Amari was aware, had ever been kept alone under the watch of an assigned group of guards. That meant this girl was important. Had something Marius, or whoever Marius was trying to please, wanted. That meant bad things for her. Amari had no doubt about that, and especially bad things for him if he sprung her from the cage, and yet how could he not? He knew more than most the terror of being taken captive and made helpless. Though looking again at the burning corpses, he supposed helpless was not an entirely accurate description of the girl, and yet something about her reminded him so much of the boy he'd lost years ago. His heart instantly ached for her. "Hold on," he said, putting his hands into the air. "Before you go throwing fireballs, or whatever it is you do, you should know I'm not him. Look closely. You'll see I'm really not much like him at all. Our eyes aren't even the same color. See?" The sharp smile faded into a somewhat uncertain frown. She looked more disappointed than doubtful, but remained silent all the same. Judging him, he thought, studying his behavior to see if he could really be trusted. Smart girl. "I'd like to help you if I can," he said, taking a few steps forward. "Are you hurt?" She didn't answer, but she really didn't need to. Now he was closer, he could see her wrists were bruised and sore beneath the twine binding them together. Her legs had been left unbound, but he could tell by looking her right ankle and possibly lower leg bones were broken. Whether she'd been beaten or taken a nasty fall, he'd hoped she'd fallen. Before she was tied and locked inside the cage, she'd have little hope of making a run for it, even if he got the thing unlocked. "So much for spring and release," he murmured, shaking his head. "You really do need my help." "You don't sound like him," the girl remarked. "But you look a lot like him, except for the long hair and that beard thing you've got going on. And you've got eyeliner on, so how do I know your eyes don't look all gold 'cause of that?" "I do try to put our face to the best use possible, but my eyes, I assure you, have been golden since birth. Mother used to say an inner light made my eyes glow amber, whereas Marius's remains a steady shade of fecal brown. Oh, she didn't say it to his face, of course. That would have been cruel," he replied with a smile. "And this is not even close to a beard, dear girl. Beards are little more than unseemly little face bushes. This is a work of art. Manscaping, they call it." Truthfully, his friend and quartermaster Kemi was the one responsible for keeping the thin goatee neatly trimmed around his mouth and chin. She also took care to trim his sideburns into neat edges, because she said it made him look more piratey. Amari suspected it was really just an excuse for her to put her hands on him, but he enjoyed having time alone to talk with her, as they'd done in the old days. Kemi would also see his hair cut into some striking form or another if given the chance, but that was where he'd always drawn the line. He'd grown his hair out, let the natural waves run wild, to defy his father, and as silly as it seemed, didn't yet feel ready to give it up. He wouldn't allow her to cut it above his shoulders, though he did usually pull it back into a ponytail to keep it out of his face. He half regretted that now. The girl might have given her trust already if he'd hidden his face behind the wayward tresses before his approach. Manscaping made the girl laugh involuntarily. It came out light as a wind chime until she tried to choke it back with a snort that made him want to laugh. He resisted, of course, but only because he knew there had to be more men moving in to either relieve the current guards or take over the transport completely. Marius would never leave anything so precious to chance, and he definitely didn't want to be in the area when his brother came calling. "Why do you look like him?" she asked, quickly regaining her composure. "He's my brother," he replied. "We're twins." "What?" "Don't make me repeat myself. I feel dirty enough already." She furrowed her brow and forced her lips to frown. "You're seriously going with the evil twin story? That's the best you can do?" "Just how old is this child?" "No, it's not the best I could do were I simply feeding you a story, but it happens to be the unfortunate truth." "Uh-huh." "Would I really lead with something so lame if it wasn't?" She shrugged. "Depends on how dumb you think I am." Again, Amari was tempted to laugh. This was like talking to a miniature version of his great-aunt Margaret, and quickly cleared his throat. "You're such a bright girl. Smart enough, I'd wager, to recognize I'm the only handsome hero likely to come off and offer assistance before Marius or one of his goons comes to check on you. Now, are you going to burn me if I move in to release you or not?" The girl blew a raspberry at him, but also nodded toward the burnt husk of a man most likely in possession of the lock key. Amari held in a disgusted groan as he poked at the smoldering remains with his staff until he managed to knock the key out of the man's pocket. The metal was still hot enough to burn as he picked it up from the ground. He cursed. Vastus, his mother's favorite, because it so closely resembled his father Costas's name, and nearly dropped the damn thing on more than one occasion before he finally got it in the lock. One quick turn and the deed was done. He stepped back to nurse his screaming fingers, allowing the girl space to push the door open and crawl out on her own accord. While she looked to have been spared the many indignities any young prisoner guarded by men could fall victim to, Amari still felt it best not to put his hands on her unless prompted to, especially since he'd grown up hearing stories of Denai capable of draining a man's very life force dry through a mere touch, and already knew for a fact this girl had a knack for fire. Best wait until asked. "You gonna untie me or what?" she asked with a grunt. "Or commanded to." "Oh, you need me for that? So sorry. I thought you could just, I don't know, burn away the bindings on your own," he replied. "Sure, if I want to burn my skin off," she said, rolling her eyes. "My wrists hurt bad enough already." Her tone remained sharp, but there was sadness behind her blue-violet eyes that melted Amari's defenses instantly. He knew that sadness and the pain that came with it, even if his own bindings had failed to leave any outward scars. He knelt down beside her and removed the twine as gently as he could. "I am sorry," he whispered, dropping the twine to the ground. "Do you think you can walk? I have a ship docked near the village. I can get you to a safe place where you can contact your family. We can help reunite you." "You don't know me." "I know you need help. If you don't want it from me, fine. But I can hardly leave you." "No, I mean you really don't have a clue who I am," she said. "How can you be close to him and not know anything?" "It takes more than simply being spawned by the same mother to make you close to someone. Marius and I are about as far apart as two people possibly can be, but that's a long story, and I've a feeling we need to get out of here quickly. Like, this instant if possible, before men pop up aiming to kill us." "He'd only kill you. He said he needs me alive." "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" She smiled at him, still sharp, but there was at least some visible warmth behind the smugness, and motioned for him to pick her up. However unlikely his tale of an evil twin seemed, she'd accepted he was the outsider in this situation, and outsiders, she'd learned, usually made the best allies, so long as they weren't looking to line their pockets with coin. He didn't have the demeanor of a man in need of an easy exchange, and that, combined with his silly manscaping and apparent disdain for Marius, was enough to elicit a bit of trust given her severely limited options. "My name is Amari, by the way," he said, grunting as he lifted her into his arms. "Just in case you need something to call out if you happen to spot an arrow flying at my head." "That's a funny name." "Has anyone ever told you what a delightful child you are?" "You talk funny, too. Where are you from?" "Does it matter?" "Marius doesn't have that accent." "Marius spent a great deal more time in our homeland, clinging to father's teat, I imagine, and father doesn't believe in speaking the same as anyone he's deemed to be beneath him, which is, by the way, nearly everyone in Visconti." She giggled despite the pain in her leg as he began carrying her toward the village. She'd never heard a grown man use the word teat in a serious sentence before, let alone in reference to his own father. "May I ask your name, or do I have to think of you only as the caged girl I graciously went out of my way to rescue?" "Tavala," she replied. "You're one to talk about funny names, Tavala. Where does that come from?" "It was my grandmother's name." "Oh. The only things ever handed down in my family were lectures and unrealistic expectations. Good for you for getting something nice." "I never knew her." She lowered her head onto his shoulder and tried to stifle a sniffle, and suddenly he felt like an asshole. For all he knew, the girl's entire family had been slaughtered trying to protect her, and here he was trying to tease in the name of distracting her from her pain. "You really have a safe place? A boat?" she asked. "I do. I call her the Gracie May. The ship, obviously, not the... Yes, I do." "You live there?" "Most of the time. We sail quite a bit." "We?" "Every ship needs a crew. Don't worry, they're good people. You'll be welcomed warmly." "If you had a safe place, why'd you come here?" "People have to eat. That means a need for supplies. Supplies take coin. Unless you know some magic trick capable of conjuring coin out of thin air, that unfortunately means having to step out into the real world every now and then to do things." "You know that's not what I meant, stupid." Amari laughed wholeheartedly. "Stupid, am I? Maybe I am. I'm sure there are many who would say letting a feral teenager in a little girl's body loose and carrying her away from the hunters who captured her a silly thing to do. But I've never let opinion stop me." Tavala wasn't sure what feral meant, but she smacked him on the side all the same. He inhaled sharply. It never ceased to amaze him how sensitive that old wound remained even after so many years had passed, and swallowed back the curse, trying to rush out his mouth. His reaction was brief. He'd learned how to disguise pain and raw emotions alike during his childhood. But Tavala caught it nonetheless. "I hurt you?" "It's fine." "You should have told me you were hurt," she said. "Yes. Just me being stupid again, I suppose. Ordinarily, I'd toss my shortcomings out into the open straight away. Hello, my name is Amari. Don't be mindful of my left side. It's a bit dodgy, don't you know? Oh, thanks for telling me. I was just about to give you a nice slap for absolutely no reason. You've saved me from looking foolish. No trouble. So very nice to meet you, by the way. We should go for drinks sometime." He glanced over to find Tavala staring at him open-mouthed, uncertain whether she ought to give him another slap or simply laugh out loud. It was the sort of look he earned quite often, and usually took great delight in. Better to leave them too awestruck, or, at the very least, dumbfounded, to stop and think about whatever it was he didn't want examined too closely.
"You remind me of my Uncle Cyrus," she said.
"Is that good or bad?" She sighed heavily and dropped her head on his shoulder.
"He talks prissy too," she replied, "except most times he doesn't even know he's doing it, so people laugh and he never knows why."
We can't all be masters of self-awareness. I sometimes envy the clueless. I really do.
"He's not as weird as you."
"I'm choosing to take that as a compliment," Amari said with a sniffle. "Where is this dense priss of an uncle, then? Should we contact him?" She laughed until she snorted.
"You really don't know anything about me."
"Yes, we've established my ignorance already. Though I'm starting to wonder if this fame of yours isn't all in your mind. No one's come charging after us yet."
"Shh! You'll jinx us."
Amari was about to laugh when the sudden bang of an explosion not nearly far enough into the distance caused him to duck low behind some gathered brush instead. He couldn't see anything from here, not even any signs of smoke belching up against the starlit sky, but he could hear definite sounds of conflict. Shouting, screaming, gunpowder igniting, metal clanging against metal, and then bone. "Is it Marius?" he asked. "The hunters?"
"Don't know. Could be. Could be lots of bad things, or it could be just my uncles Remy and Dorian coming to get me. I know they've been looking."
Amari wondered just how many uncles the girl had, and why they were so well armed, but kept his mouth shut. He had no idea what or who lots of bad things might entail, or what they hoped to gain by raiding a fishing village. But Tavalla's frankness told him such skirmishes were common in Atraxia. It was ironic, really. He'd spent so much time in virtual isolation, out on the sea surrounded by endless blue up above and all around, trying to improve the small bubble of the world around him, that he'd somehow managed to remain ignorant about the lands beyond it. He'd heard stories of what things were like here during the reckoning, of course, from gossips and survivors alike, but as far as he knew, things settled down nicely once it was over. The weather returned to normal. Humans and Denai learned to work together to rebuild, sometimes even choosing to be neighbors inside the same villages and cities. The incinerator was shut down and handed over to the Denai to do with as they saw fit. Hunters were declared outlaws, and for the first time in decades the West and East, formerly divided between opposing rulers, were poised to unite in marriage. That was, in fact, one of the reasons Amari had waited as long as he had to visit Atraxia in the first place. He'd avoided it at first to keep his men safe from the reckoning, sure. But afterwards, the reports were so optimistic he'd felt his time and resources would be better spent elsewhere, in those smaller countries or cities where signs of promise hadn't been seen for ages. How, he wondered, had Atraxia gone from the rumored land of potential dreams and harmony to the bloody awful chaos he heard unfolding now? Could it all be Marius's doing? The thought caused a small cramp in the pit of his stomach, strong enough to trigger sudden nausea. The feeling only worsened when he saw a familiar violet-white flare pop up into the sky. It lingered for a few seconds before disintegrating into a shower of sparkling dust. It was sure a lovely sight to see for those unaware of its meaning, but Amari considered it about the worst thing he could have witnessed at the moment. It was a signal from the Gracie May, Kemi's way of informing him the fighting had gotten too close for comfort. The ship and the safety on board it was already sailing away from the harbor. "Vastus," he muttered.
"Your good people left you. didn't they?"
Tavalla stated.
"Aren't you like their captain or something? Don't they have to wait for you?"
"We've a protocol for this sort of thing. It'll be fine. You and I just need to lay low for a bit. It'll be fine. You'll be fine. For all we know, your killer uncles will come charging by looking for you any moment now, and you'll be on your way home." The girl attempted to hide fresh tears. Strangely enough, he found himself doing the very same as he once again picked her up and took off in the opposite direction of the conflict. He didn't need to ask to know the girl didn't have a home left to return to. That was also a feeling he understood well, perhaps now more than ever.